In this video, we are going to talk about detrimental fungi, and these are the fungi that cause illness, death, and disease. Some fungi are parasitic, and parasitism is a symbiotic relationship in which one member benefits while the other is harmed. So in this example here, the fungus will benefit while the host organism is harmed. And the host organism might be a plant, an animal, etc. And with parasitism, what happens is that the parasite, in this case the fungus, damages or kills the host because they compete for resources. And these resources could be things like nutrients, energy, space, etc. So the host organism needs nutrients and energy in order to survive, but if the parasite comes along and takes that, then the host organism might not be able to survive because it's giving all of its resources to the parasite. Fungi can also be pathogenic, which means that it can cause disease by damaging host tissues. In this case, it can also lead to death if enough of the tissue is damaged. One example of a detrimental fungus is Claviceps purpurea, and it causes ergot, which is a plant disease that affects cereal crops, such as wheat, rice, corn, oats, and barley, with rye being the most affected. And it is dangerous because it can reduce crop yield, which can lead to problems like not enough food, so it can lead to famine. You can see this picture right here. You can see the fungus attached to the plant. This fungus can also cause ergotism, which is a disease that affects animals. And this happens if an animal eats a plant that is infected with this fungus. It can cause hallucinations, gangrene, which is essentially the tissues dying, and it's especially a problem in cattle because it can decrease the amount of milk that cows make. One of the active ingredients in this fungus is lysergic acid, which is a precursor to LSD. And LSD is a chemical compound that can cause hallucinations. Other forms of fungal plant pathogens include smut, rust, powdery mildew, and downy mildew. So this first picture here is showing smut. And this is a fungus that is harming the plant that it is attached to. This is a picture of rust. Once again, it's just a fungus causing this discoloration, which is also decreasing the quality of the plant. Downy mildew and powdery mildew can be seen on this picture here. And once again, it is damaging the plant that it is associated with. Another way that fungi are detrimental is through the release of toxins. So there's a type of fungi called Aspergillus, and it releases the aflatoxins. And these aflatoxins can be carcinogenic. Carcinogenic just means that it can cause cancer. So Aspergillus can be dangerous because it destroys crops, so it can lead to hunger and famine. And it can lead to food recalls because if someone eats food that is contaminated with these aflatoxins, it can cause serious health problems. There are a couple of different terms associated with fungal disease, and it kind of depends on how the fungus is causing harm to the host. So first of all, mycosis is a fungal disease that results from direct damage due to a fungus. An example of this would be something like valley fever or ringworm. And we will talk about these in more detail on some future slides. Mycotoxicosis is poisoning due to ingesting food that is contaminated by fungal toxins. And fungal toxins are also called mycotoxins. So an example of this would be those aflatoxins produced by the aspergillus. Mycetismus is what happens when someone is poisoned or an organism is poisoned due to directly ingesting poisonous mushrooms. So this would be an example of you maybe going out into the forest and eating a mushroom because you think it's safe, and you are actually ingesting a toxic mushroom directly. Some fungi can also cause allergic reactions to certain people that are sensitive to it, and these allergic reactions can cause problems, including anaphylaxis. And anaphylaxis is where the tissues swell up, and it's especially dangerous if the tissues in the throat swell up because then the person can't breathe. Fungal infections are hard to treat. First of all, antibiotics do not work against fungal infections. Antibiotics only kill prokaryotes, but fungi are eukaryotes. And the problem is that, especially if you're talking about plants and animals are also eukaryotes. So antibiotics are relatively safe to take because they are designed to attack parts of prokaryotes that eukaryotes don't have. But if you try to develop an antifungal medication, since fungi are eukaryotes and so are plants and animals, we have the same structures in our cells and the same enzymes, or at least similar enzymes. So it's hard to develop a drug that can kill a fungus that won't also kill the healthy cells in a plant or an animal. On the next several slides, we're going to talk about fungal diseases that specifically affect animals. And we can talk about fungal diseases that are superficial, meaning that they only affect the skin, or we can talk about diseases that are more systemic, meaning that they can enter the body and actually affect internal tissues. So one example of a superficial infection that affects the skin is something that's just called chytrid. And this disease is caused by this fungus right here that is part of the phylum known as Chytridiomycota. This particular fungus is especially harmful to amphibians and frogs. And one reason why is because it coats or covers the skin, and amphibians, including frogs, they actually have gas exchange across the skin. So they kind of breathe across their skin. So the presence of this fungus interferes with that gas exchange, which kills the organism. And this is a really kind of major problem affecting amphibians, especially in North America, but maybe other continents as well. And this is a picture of a frog that actually has chytrid, this kind of white substance on its belly. And this frog is dead in this picture. Another serious fungal disease in wildlife is something called white nose syndrome that affects bats, and it's caused by this fungus right here. And the way that this negatively impacts the bat is that bats hibernate during the winter, but bats that are infected with this fungal disease, they wake up more often, which means they use up their fat reserves faster and they don't make it through the end of their hibernation. So they die due to lack of energy, or when they wake up from their hibernation, they don't have the energy needed to go out and forage for food. And you can see this picture here. You can see these little white spots on the bat's nose, and this is that fungus. Another superficial fungal infection that affects skin, and this is an example of one that can affect humans, is something called ringworm. And ringworm is not caused by a worm. So I don't know how it gets its name, but it is actually caused by a fungus. And what happens is that the fungus lives on the skin, and the exoenzymes, so remember these are the enzymes that the fungus is secreting out of itself, breaks down keratin. And keratin is a protein that is found in the skin. And this is the cause of kind of the more familiar terms of, or familiar infections known as athlete's foot and jock itch. And you can see the fungus, the ringworm, in this picture here. Now, we mentioned that some fungal diseases can actually become systemic. And systemic mycoses are ones that are actually going deeper into the body and affecting internal organs. So one example of this is something called valley fever, which is caused by this fungus here. And this is the kind of the official medical name of this illness that is more commonly just referred to as valley fever. And this is a fungus that is primarily found in the southwestern United States. And I used to live in Phoenix, Arizona. And before I moved out to Phoenix, I had never heard of valley fever, but it is a very commonly known fungal infection to people that live in Arizona, Nevada, Southern California, and those surrounding areas. It lives in the dry dirt of the desert, and if it gets kicked up by, maybe landscaping or just by hiking, the fungus can be inhaled, and it actually affects the lungs. So it can cause a sort of pneumonia if it is inhaled. Now, some people can clear the fungus and they recover from valley fever without any long-term effects. But in some people and also other animals, it's really known to affect dogs as well. But the fungus can actually become even further systemic, meaning that it can travel in the bloodstream and affect other parts of the body as well. So it can actually turn into a chronic infection that can damage other tissues in addition to the lungs. Histoplasmosis is another disease caused by a fungus. In this case, it's a yeast infection, and it can cause pulmonary infections that can also lead to swelling of the meninges. And the meninges are these tissue coatings or tissue coverings of the central nervous system, which includes the brain and spinal cord. And this can form a sort of meningitis. So itis just means inflammation. So meningitis just means that the meninges, or these coverings of the brain and spinal cord, are inflamed. And it can be caused by bacteria, viruses, or in this case, fungi. And you can imagine if these tissues start to swell, it's going to put pressure on the brain and spinal cord, and it can actually limit the activity of the neurons. So it can affect the nervous system. There are also opportunistic mycoses. And what that means is that these are fungi that are very common in and on the body, but usually the immune system is able to keep the fungus in check. So even though the fungus is present, it's not really causing an infection or an outbreak, and it's not really causing symptoms. However, if someone becomes immunocompromised, it can basically prevent the immune system from suppressing the fungal activity, and it can turn into a full-blown infection. Some examples of immunocompromised individuals could be individuals with HIV and AIDS, individuals on chemotherapy, individuals on anti rejection meds. This would be due to receiving a transplant, so like a heart or kidney transplant. These infections can also break out after someone takes antibiotics. And that's because antibiotics kill off the bad bacteria, but sometimes they also kill off the good bacteria. And remember, back when we talked about prokaryotes, we talked about the microbiome. So one of the services that these beneficial bacteria provide for us and other organisms is they help to basically outcompete these pathogenic organisms. But if you take antibiotics, the antibiotics, like I said, can kill the bad bacteria, but it also kills off the good bacteria. And if it does so, then these fungal infections can then break out because there are no good bacteria to outcompete them for resources. And one example of a common opportunistic mycosis is Candida, also known as thrush, and this is a type of yeast infection. And this picture shows it on the tongue here, so that all of this white material is the Candida. This can also happen in the vagina. So the yeast infections associated with the vagina are associated with this Candida yeast infection. And once again, they are more common after a woman takes antibiotics.